I feel marvelous. They give me a feeling of love.
The world once knelt at the feet of Judy Garland. To her audience, she was little Dorothy, clad in shimmering ruby slippers with a crystalline voice that could reach the most distant stars. For half a century,
Judy Garland!
Hollywood erected a shrine of purity around her, hallowing her as the queen of entertainment, an eternal icon of untarnished glory. Her romances with dashing leading men were painted by the press as radiant chapters in a modern-day fairy tale. But behind that radiant smile on those glossy magazine covers lurked a horrific truth they labored to entomb. Why did America's daughter have to end her life on a cold June night in London? There were no spotlights, no thunderous applause. There was only a cheap, rented room, the suffocating stench of poison, a mountains of crushing debt, and a soul drained to the point of a desolate ruin. The bitter truth only truly rose from the grave after her final breath, right beside her deathbed. They discovered a secret memoir lines scrawled with the final, flickering embers of her strength in those pages. Judy Garland did not call out to her fans. She named 8 men. These were the men who directly commanded and staged this sequence of tragedies. They transformed an innocent child into a profit-making machine, surveilled down to her every breath, from the pills forced upon her to stay awake for work, to the pills forced upon her to sleep for recovery. Every move was calculated to break the will and self-respect of a human being. They exploited her talent as if it were an industrial resource, until that woman was nothing more than a living ruin, exhausted and utterly shattered before she finally passed away. Now, we shall step through the magnificent velvet curtain and into the deepest shadows of the Hollywood Golden Age. Every name Judy uttered in her final hour will serve as a tolling bell of warning, unmasking the faces of the predators masquerading as gentlemen. 1. Louis B. Mayer, the Lord and the century's great deception at the MGM empire. Louis B. Mayer was never merely a movie mogul. He was the mastermind behind a ruthless and filth-ridden machine of deceit, a man who meticulously staged a fraudulent family drama to mask the reality of a modern-day slave factory. Under the dignified guise of the Great Father guiding the MGM family, Mayer was, in truth, a supreme manipulator who peered into the profound loneliness and hunger for kinship within a child to set a psychological trap with no escape. Mayer's cruelty did not stop at labor exploitation. It resided in the fact that he deceived Judy into believing he was the only person on earth who truly loved and protected her. In Mayer's eyes, art was nothing more than a glittering shroud, and his paternal lies were the invisible shackles designed to secure the asset known as Judy Garland. He represents a scorching, violent truth when deception is committed in the name of love. It slaughters the victim's soul long before they realize they are being executed upon their own throne. The tragedy ignited on a fateful day in 1935. Frances Gumm, a 13-year-old girl with a heart already splintered by the death of her father, stepped into Mayer's office, a room thick with the scent of expensive leather and suffocating cigar smoke. She entered with the naive conviction that she had found a second father, a steadfast anchor amidst the vanity of Hollywood. Mayer harvested this emotional blind spot to perform the most cold-blooded identity theft in history. He embraced the child, declaring with absolute authority, "From now on, I am your father. The world out there is nothing but a pack of vultures. MGM is your only home, and only I can keep you safe." That was the first blade. He forced her to discard the name Frances Gumm, to become Judy Garland, not to celebrate her talent, but to sever her human roots, transforming her into a creature with no past. a piece of property under the absolute ownership of the MGM empire. Judy believed in the promise of a hearth, only to realize too late that she had signed a life sentence in a misery factory draped in silk and diamonds. More terrifyingly, Mayer utilized a brutal campaign of psychological gaslighting to force Judy into a fraudulent reality of his own making. He convinced her she was a hunchback child, a hideous creature with an obsolete look that the whole world would vomit at the sight of, if not for the lights and powders of MGM, shattered and vulnerable. Judy was completely broken by this lie. She looked into the mirror and saw no genius. She saw only a freak in need of Mayer's salvation. This deception permanently decimated her ability to define herself, sentencing her to a lifetime of seeking validation from her abusers because she believed she was fundamentally inferior and owed Mayer her very life. To maintain the illusion of the perfect girl next door, an image Mayer hand-carved to satisfy the public appetite, he used honeyed whispers to cover physical torture. Mayer would frequently stroke Judy's hair, gently telling her to shove agonizing rubber inserts into her nose or wrap bandages around her chest until she could barely breathe. He spoke in a tone of wounded concern. "Just bear it for a moment, my dear. I only do this because I don't want anyone to see these tiny flaws and mock my angel. You want the whole world at your feet, don't you? This is our little secret, so you can always be the brightest." The pinnacle of this deceit was the miracle drugs. Mayer personally handed her amphetamines, smiling as he said, "Here, daughter. These are the energy candies I've prepared just for you, so you can always soar like a goddess on stage. Don't be afraid. They will ensure you never feel fatigue." When Judy reached a state of collapse, trembling with nosebleeds, Mayer would tenderly embrace her, deceiving her into taking barbiturates with a soft lullaby. "Drink this, so I can lead you into the most peaceful sleep. And tomorrow you will be the great Judy Garland for all of us once again." Mayer tricked Judy into seeing her agony as an obligation of love, stripping her of the clarity to realize she was being robbed of her right to be human. There is a horrific fragment of history often kept in the shadows, revealing exactly how Mayer blinded his victim once, driven by the uncontrollable hunger of puberty. Judy secretly ate a dry crust of bread. To Mayer, this was not just a breach of discipline, it was the perfect pretext for a psychological execution. He did not strike her like a common tyrant. Instead, he played the role of a father betrayed to the marrow of his bones. Mayer seized Judy by the hair, dragging the trembling girl before a massive mirror. He used his brutal hands to press her face against the cold glass, forcing her to look into her own red, tear-filled eyes instead of shouting. He lowered his voice to a bone-chillingly sweet whisper. "Judy, my beloved daughter, look into my eyes. My heart tightens to see you destroying yourself like this. You know I only want you to be the most radiant angel, the one the whole world worships. But look in the mirror. If the audience saw you in this wretched state, they would turn their backs. They would tear you apart with their cruel words. I have sacrificed my health, my honor, and my fortune just to build a perfect shell to protect you from the cruelty out there. And yet, you would trade all my love for a meaningless piece of bread. Why are you so heartless as to hurt this old father so?" In that moment, Judy was leveled by a magnificent lie. She believed Mayer screamed because he loved her too much, because he feared for her future. She did not see herself as a victim. She saw herself as the sinner who had wounded father. Mayer's lie about sacrifice was the most ruthless poison, turning Judy into a willing slave. She lived in a state of horrific guilt, believing she owed this executioner every breath and every spark of her fame. Louis B. Mayer built a throne for Judy Garland, but in reality, he tricked her into digging the grave for her own soul before she was even grown, turning her into a woman who would spend her life adoring the very man who was, day by day, claiming her life. 2. Raymond Katz, the destroyer, in the dapper suit. Raymond Katz appeared with the expensive tailoring and professional smirk of a high-level financial strategist. He executed a deception that was as simple as it was devastating. He tricked Judy Garland into believing her fortune was being safely guarded, while in truth, he was a common thief lurking behind a veil of spreadsheets. Katz deceived Judy into becoming a victim who was entirely blinded by his expertise, while she believed she was a reigning star being catered to. She was actually a mere currency generator shackled to a treadmill of debt he had meticulously constructed. He is the quintessential predator who used legal filings and ironclad contracts to annihilate an artist before she even sensed the blade. The tragedy ignited in 1963 when Judy Garland stood on the precipice of bankruptcy, her reputation tattered by the scandals of the past, at her most desperate hour. Raymond Katz descended like a savior from the heavens. He took Judy's trembling hands, looked into her eyes with a counterfeit sincerity, and declared, "Judy, your talent is a national treasure. Do not let these vulgar numbers tarnish your artistic soul. From now on, let Raymond be your shield against the financial storms." This was the prologue to a theft of the century. He tricked her into signing exclusive management contracts for the Judy Garland Show on CBS, a project into which she poured her very life, naively believing that Katz would be the one to sweep away the wreckage of her existence. Judy had fallen into the net. She voluntarily entrusted her fate to a hunter who was already sharpening his knife behind her back. Katz did not use whips to subdue Judy. He used opulence as a form of anesthesia to paralyze her survival instincts. He fattened the prey with magnificent banquets and nauseating flattery, while his hands were silently siphoning the last drops of blood from her bank accounts. He deceived her into believing her assets were growing exponentially, encouraging her to spend recklessly to maintain her star image while he conducted filthy backroom deals. He stood by as massive tax debts accumulated and inflated production costs to hollow out the profits. Whenever Judy grew anxious about the mounting bills, Katz would use a honeyed tone to soothe her. "Beloved Judy, your pure soul shouldn't be bothered by these ugly numbers. Everything is under control. Just continue to shine on stage, and I will handle the rest. You trust me, don't you?" By swapping professional accountability for a performance of loyal friendship, Katz tricked Judy into exhausting every last drop of her labor, turning her into a wretched victim unaware she was building a castle on a quagmire of debt. The dressing room at CBS that year did not smell of fame. It reeked of the stomach-turning scent of cold sweat and ultimate terror. Behind the smooth, flickering images on screen was a garbage reality where Raymond Katz was conducting the most ruthless financial extraction in Hollywood history. Judy lay there, trembling and spent like a singing carcass. Katz entered, cloaked in the glamour of a savior, but in truth, he was her terminator. He didn't need to shout more sophisticately. He gently draped a silk scarf around her neck, his fingers gliding over her pale, deathly cold skin like a serpent seeking a place to strike. He offered her the pills, the sugar-coated poison, and hissed, venomous, sweet words into her ear that would make any listener shudder. "Dearest Judy, look at yourself in the mirror. What do you see? A decaying wreck. But don't be afraid, just one of these energy candies, and you'll be the only goddess again. The whole world out there is a pack of demons, waiting to tear you apart the second you fall. I am the only one left standing here to protect you. Swallow it, and I'll clear away this mountain of debt for you. You only have me to trust. Judy, if not for me, you'd die in the mud tonight." Judy, in her drug-addled stupor and clawed by a physical hunger for the pills, swallowed the bait whole. She was completely unaware that she was a victim being stripped of her final spark of life. She even felt a surge of gratitude toward the man who was tightening the noose. But the horrific reality was that the moment the show was canceled due to Katz's own catastrophic decisions, he vanished along with the embezzled profits. When Judy finally awoke from her chemical haze, she found no spotlight, only the cold, encroaching walls of tax collection notices and the foreclosure of her mansion. Raymond Katz had literally turned a legend into a homeless person, penniless in both fortune and soul. His betrayal was a knife dipped in honey. Leaving the world disgusted by the reality, Judy had been eaten alive by the man she called her benefactor. He had tricked her into squeezing out every ounce of her vitality in exchange for a void, leaving behind a shattered Judy Garland who, until the very end of her life, trembled whenever she recalled the smile of the man in the dapper suit. 3. Vincente Minnelli, The Fraudulent Marriage and the Deception. Cloaking a filthy truth. Vincente Minnelli's deception of Judy Garland was not merely a romantic tragedy. It was a ruthless conspiracy to hijack her fame, cloaked in the polished veneer of the American dream. Minnelli tricked Judy into a lavender marriage, a meticulously staged performance designed to create the image of a model family with a white picket fence, hiding his homosexuality from a prejudice-filled Hollywood. He didn't need a wife to love. He needed the name Judy Garland as a shield for his secret nights of indulgence with other men. To him, Judy was nothing more than an expensive living prop to safeguard his status as a brilliant director. In her blood-streaked final memoirs, Judy Garland stripped bare the essence of the bastard Minnelli. Vincente never looked at me as a woman to love. He saw me as an armoire or an expensive sofa that needed to be placed in the right light to beautify his gentlemanly mask. When he meticulously adjusted every light on my face in Meet Me in St. Louis, he wasn't making me beautiful for my sake. He was polishing the shell he needed to survive. I mistook that pathological control for care. I surrendered my entire soul to a man who, in his heart, had no place for women. This deception reached a revolting level as Minnelli casually nurtured Judy's drug addiction, keeping her in a state of stupor so she would submissively play the role of the zombie wife, never questioning or demanding the truth. The pinnacle of his baseness occurred one night when Judy Garland returned home early, hoping to find a spark of warmth amidst her depression. The mansion was terrifyingly silent, save for the scent of expensive men's cologne lingering in the hallway. When she pushed open the door to the master bedroom, the place she believed was a sacred sanctuary, her reality shattered. Vincente Minnelli lay in the arms of another man on their very bed. There was no scream, no apology. Minnelli simply sat up calmly, straightened the lapel of his silk robe, and looked at her with the emotionless eyes of a director who had just finished a failed take. His cruelty reached an extreme when Minnelli dispassionately uttered the words that exposed the true nature of the lie. "Judy, stop the dramatics. You understand perfectly well that this marriage is a commercial agreement. I gave you this house with the white picket fence, gave you the title of Mrs. Minnelli so you could hide your mountain of drug-addicted filth from the public. I needed a beautiful mask for my private life. And you were the most expensive mask I could buy on the market. Do not demand love or fidelity on a film set. Now, take your pills and get out. You are ruining the lighting and the atmosphere of this room." In that moment, Judy realized the house with the white picket fence of her dreams was, in fact, just a cardboard backdrop erected in haste to hide a filthy truth, and behind that polished paint was a bottomless abyss of despair. But the true tragedy was that by the time Judy Garland realized she had been deceived, the door had been locked from the outside, it was too late for salvation. Legally binding contracts, a fading career, and her own innocent children became the hostages that tethered her to Minnelli's fraudulent empire. She understood she had lost the game entirely. Her soul rotted from the abuse of sedatives used to fill the icy void of loneliness amidst glamorous parties. "I am dying in a house built on that bastard's lies," she wrote in ultimate despair. "He has drained the last spark of my life just to maintain his cowardly title of a model director." Judy Garland was left a mental invalid, imprisoned within the very lie she once believed was destiny, until death became the only escape from the sickening theater known as Vincente Minnelli. Poor Guy McIlwaine, the opportunistic hunter in The Mask of a Savior. When Judy Garland was kicked to the curb by the MGM empire in 1950, she was nothing more than a soulless husk, a swan with broken wings groping for an exit from the mire of abandonment. This was the golden hour for vultures to scent the stench of desperation. Guy McIlwaine appeared, carrying no weapons but a perfect suit, a glamorous smile, and the most terrifying poison of all hollow hope. He deceived Judy into believing he was the only one in Hollywood who still dared to stand by her, turning her into a victim completely manipulated by a fraudulent script of revival. McIlwaine's deception reflected the darkest social reality of Hollywood, a place where human beings are merely barcodes on commodities with expiration dates. He held Judy's hands, which were trembling from drug withdrawal and profound self-loathing, looked into her eyes with a counterfeit sincerity, and swore, "Judy, the world owes you an apology. Let me lead you back to the throne. I have scripts ready that will bring the Academy to their knees at your feet." Judy, whose defensive instincts had been decimated by Louis B. Mayer since she was a child, fell into the trap without a hint of suspicion. She could not have imagined that the once illustrious name Judy Garland was, in McIlwaine's eyes, no longer an artistic genius, but merely a master key used to open the doors of elite boardrooms and a springboard to launch younger, more obedient, and more sustainably profitable faces. McIlwaine's betrayal unfolded slowly but ruthlessly, like oxygen being drained from a sealed room. He tricked her into signing suffocating exclusive agreements, transforming her into a trophy to elevate the prestige of his management firm. While Judy withered away beside a silent telephone, daily staring into the mirror and insulting her own faded beauty with alcohol and sedatives, McIlwaine was dispassionately taking the best opportunities, the roles he had sworn were reserved for her, and handing them directly to younger actresses, to him. Judy Garland was merely a burnt-out film role, a PR tool used to build his image as a compassionate manager before callously tossing her into the dustbin of history. The truth was stripped bare the day Judy accidentally read that a major film project she had long hungered for had officially begun filming with a beautiful young lead, the very protégé McIlwaine was now grooming, when she confronted him with all the accumulated bitterness and resentment of her soul. McIlwaine no longer maintained his dignified front. He looked at her with the contempt of a butcher eyeing a piece of rancid meat. "Judy, look in the mirror. Do you honestly think audiences still want to see this wrecked corpse on the screen? Your time is up. I've been using your stale fame just to keep your career on life support all this time. You should be grateful. Stop bothering me. I don't have time to shepherd a dying person." In that moment, Judy Garland realized she had lost her final bet on the game of trust. She understood that McIlwaine's care and protection were, in fact, a filthy act of glory shepherding. This betrayal didn't just slam the doors of Hollywood shut. It extinguished her very will to survive. She fell into a state of hemorrhaging hatred for the man who had deceived her, and hatred for herself for being so naive. Judy realized a violent social reality in this place. Friendship and loyalty are merely commodities with expiration dates calculated by revenue. when she discovered she was nothing more than a pawn discarded without mercy in the game of an opportunistic hunter. The soul of Judy Garland was shattered beyond any hope of repair, plunging her even deeper into the abyss of self-destruction. 5. Busby Berkeley. The industrialist of art and the deceptive descent into the mire of addiction. Do not gaze upon those flawless, kaleidoscopic dance routines and mistake them for a dream. In reality, they were operated like the most macabre and torturous factory in Hollywood history. Busby Berkeley was no director. He was a tyrannical warden, a man who deceived Judy Garland into believing that being crushed under the blinding glare of spotlights was a divine privilege reserved for geniuses. Berkeley's deception was systemic and chillingly ruthless. He transformed chemicals into production raw materials, tricking Judy into bartering her final shred of humanity for hollow accolades, turning her into a victim manipulated by an addiction whose seeds he personally sowed. Berkeley's malice was profound because he subverted the very concept of health. He deceived Judy by planting a toxic seeds of psychological gaslighting from her very first days on the rehearsal floor. Judy, you are not a normal girl. You are the most vital component of this visual engine. Your body is not permitted to feel fatigue. Under the guise of aesthetic perfection, Berkeley forced Judy to work 18 hours a day to sustain this frantic, inhuman pace. He deceived her into believing that stimulants were artistic energy, a necessity for her to glow, blinded by a desperate hunger for validation. Judy fell into the trap, surrendering her entire nervous system to the amphetamines supplied by Berkeley and the MGM empire. The naked reality behind the shimmering, white picket fence was a ghastly sight. Judy Garland collapsing onto the hardwood floor, her nosebleed staining her rouge, her lungs gasping for oxygen that wasn't there. But in Berkeley's eyes, this was merely a mechanical failure instead of a hospital. He ordered medical staff to plunge massive doses of amphetamines directly into the 16-year-old child to resurrect her body for the shot. Berkeley stood by dispassionately, watching Judy tremble, her pupils dilated with drug-induced shock and her mind a clouded void. Yet her feet were forced to move to the rhythm because she had been tricked into believing it was a noble sacrifice. The deception reached an extreme when he convinced her that the sedatives used after her shift to force her into sleep were gifts from heaven, when in truth, they were the permanent chains locking her life into an inescapable mire of addiction. The consequence of this deception was the total annihilation of a human being. The stimulants burned away every ounce of Judy's youth, transforming her from a vibrant girl into a zombie that moved only under the command of neon lights. When the spotlight eventually dimmed, Berkeley and his fellow exploiters callously tossed her into the shadows, leaving her to struggle alone with the withdrawal pangs that tore at her soul. Her life became a long, agonizing sequence of hallucinations, panic, and a shattered body no longer capable of self-control. Judy Garland left behind a mournful final testament, like a suicide note bleeding from the open wound of a survivor of an artistic slaughterhouse. Busby Berkeley didn't need me to sing. He needed a corpse that moved on chemicals. Every step I took on that rehearsal floor was a step toward a grave of addiction. He tricked me into believing the blood on the floor was a point of pride, while he casually used poison to squeeze out every last drop of my life. When I fell from an overdose, he didn't see a human being dying. He saw a ruined take that needed to be fixed with a fresh injection. The most agonizing part of this history is that Judy realized the truth only when it was far too late for salvation. Berkeley's betrayal turned the pure joy of singing into a shuddering nightmare of gunpowder and pills. She was left with a crippled physique, a mind rotted by narcotics, and a hemorrhaging hatred for the man who had murdered her in the name of art at the end of her life. Judy Garland understood the bitter truth in the eyes of predators like Berkeley. She was never a star. She was merely an expensive machine. Part run until it was completely incinerated by chemicals and savage selfishness, a life assassinated slowly by the very thing she once believed was the love of art. 6. Tyrone Power, the heart butcher and the most cruel romantic deception. Within the dark roll call of predators who tore at the soul of Judy Garland, Tyrone Power emerges as a dashing phantom possessing the essence of the most cold-blooded butcher, a man who did not merely swap trust for lies, but heartlessly executed a maternal assassination at the very center of a fraudulent romantic script. Tyrone hunted Judy at her most fractured moment. Following the psychological wreckage left by Louis B. Mayer, he utilized his godlike visage to hypnotize his victim, leading her to believe he was her final sanctuary. In reality, Judy was a victim manipulated by her own desperate hunger for a true home, a vulnerability that Tyrone harvested to the very marrow of her bones. Tyrone Power's deception was a velvet-wrapped horror movie. He transformed Judy's life into an execution ground of hollow oaths and empty promises. He swore he would abandon his current marriage to build a life with her, that house with the white picket fence she had hungered for since childhood. Judy, perpetually starved for validation, surrendered her soul and body to him, unaware she was merely a temporary playroom for a profligate actor. The manipulation reached a sickening peak as he exploited her psychological trauma to paralyze her defensive instincts, convincing her that his possession of her was a sacred blessing from the heavens. The tragedy exploded with a raw, shocking reality when Judy Garland discovered she was carrying the child of her dream lover. She wept with joy, believing this small miracle would end her long, decaying sequence of solitude. But to the heart butcher, the child was no product of love. It was a stain, threatening the flawless image of the cinematic god he had spent years crafting. Tyrone Power felt no spark of remorse. He coldly threw an envelope filled with cash at her, the price of a human life, along with the address of a clandestine abortion clinic, and a ruthless threat that tore her soul asunder. "Judy, handle this piece of trash yourself, or I will vanish from your life instantly. Don't let that filthy fetus ruin my career." The maternal assassination picture, this harrowing, shuddering scene. An international legend, a woman whose childhood was stolen by Louis B. Mayer, now lying solitary on a cold iron bed in a room reeking of chemicals and death. She was there to kill her own child because of the savage selfishness of the man she trusted with her life. This was no medical procedure. It was the most violent maternal assassination, where Tyrone Power permanently severed Judy's maternal calling and her very sense of humanity. But the betrayal reached its most revolting level only weeks later. Judy Garland read the news in a state of paralysis. Tyrone Power was radiantly celebrating a magnificent, high society wedding to Linda Christian. He had tricked her into killing their child, tricked her into weeping tears of profound agony, and then dispassionately stepped over her spiritual corpse to build a home with another woman. In her final, death-shadowed memoirs, saturated with rage and hatred, Judy unmasked the true face of this glamorous bastard. Tyrone Power was a demon with an angel's face, a butcher who specialized in carving up bleeding hearts. He tricked me into murdering my own flesh and blood with filthy, false promises, only to immediately marry over the bones of my child and my own spirit. He didn't love me. He loved the way I collapsed and knelt at his feet. Tyrone stripped away the last of my life force, leaving me a childless mother and a woman butchered in both mind and body. The moment she realized she had been entirely deceived was the moment the soul of Judy Garland shattered beyond repair. The smoldering hatred and the total collapse of her faith in men drove her to her first suicide attempt, a desperate act to escape the foul-smelling reality that Tyrone and Hollywood had woven around her. She realized a brutal truth in the eyes of men like Tyrone Power. Her heart was merely a piece of meat for a butcher to carve in order to feed his fraudulent fame. Judy Garland was left in a mire of desolation, carrying the bleeding scar of a stolen motherhood and a victimhood that reached the very marrow, a flickering carcass waiting for the final release. 7. Arthur Freed, the ruthless profiteer and the deception of the Oz paradise. Arthur Freed did not enter Judy Garland's life as an artistic godfather. He was a cold-blooded profiteer who managed her career with the chilling detachment of an accountant liquidating damaged assets, standing behind the most dazzling spectacles of the MGM empire. Freed deceived Judy with the illusion of immortality to shroud a calculated process of labor exploitation and psychological power harassment. His deception was particularly insidious because he materialized Judy's entire existence, converting her soul into a biological spare part with a strictly monitored expiration date, all to serve the revenue reports of his musical dynasty. Freed's parasitic nature resided in his establishment of a tyrannical regime. On the film set a place where he didn't practice art, but rather operated a soul slaughterhouse wrapped in velvet. We must look directly at a shivering truth that still echoes today. Those who masquerade as mentors are often the most vicious predators. Freed tricked Judy into believing that physical self-destruction under the blinding glare of the spotlights was the highest testament to a star's character. For decades, he wielded absolute power to conduct acts of harassment and mental manipulation, leaving a defenseless child with no means of resistance. Imagine this ghastly reality during the recording sessions for The Wizard of Oz, when Judy was so exhausted she could no longer stand. Freed stood dispassionately behind the studio glass, sipping a cold martini. He watched her with the clinical eyes of an engineer calculating the failure rate of a machine. He was a direct architect in the chemical management of Judy's body, forcing her to believe that stimulants and sedatives were essential tools of the trade to maintain her legendary status. To Freed, her singing was never art. It was the death rattle of a commodity being squeezed to maximize end-of-quarter profits. Furthermore, Freed's deception involved a systematic annihilation of her dignity. He tricked Judy into believing she owed him her career, while in truth, he was siphoning the marrow of her talent to nourish his own personal empire. Whenever Judy showed signs of resistance or mental collapse, Freed used his power to isolate her, making her feel like artistic refuse without his guidance. The most bone-chilling fact is that Freed was fully aware that the mountain of poison he forced her to swallow was eroding a human being's internal organs. But for this parasite, as long as Judy could still produce the high notes that minted gold, her internal rot was simply not a line item on his balance sheet. Freed's deception was a clinical assassination of humanity performed with the practiced ease of a butcher wearing silk gloves. The pinnacle of this wretchedness occurred in 1950, when Judy Garland finally shattered under the weight of years of spiritual draining. Instead of reaching out a hand to save the artist who had brought him millions, Freed executed the coldest disposal of a part in Hollywood history. He dispassionately signed the order to fire her from the project Annie Get Your Gun, tossing her out of the studio like an obsolete tool whose warranty had expired. Imagine this clinical cruelty. Freed looked at a broken, gasping Judy and saw only a pile of scrap metal ruining his financial statements. The deception concluded with an absolute betrayal of the human spirit. Freed ordered her name and presence entirely erased from the studio's future plans. He scratched her name out of his ledgers, indifferent to the fact that he had spent years seeding her blood with toxins in exchange for blood-soaked Oscars. This revelation hit Judy when she was already penniless. creating a hemorrhaging hatred as she realized she had been spiritually murdered by the very architect she once believed was her greatest benefactor. Arthur Freed did not teach me how to shine. He taught me how to self-immolate, to warm his filthy seat of power. In the name of art, he forced me to swallow every pill of poison, turning the dream of Oz into a graveyard reeking of chemicals. When I rotted and lost my trade-in value, he callously threw this wrecked corpse into the darkness like a broken toy. Freed tricked me into signing the most barbaric soul-selling contract in history, only to calmly count his money over the total destruction of a human being. 8. Bernard Delfont, the amorous parasite and the sordid media assassination. Bernard Delfont emerges in the final chapter of Judy Garland's life not as a rescuing producer, but as a vile scavenger of tragedy. He was a man who orchestrated a massive, calculated media assassination to harvest profit from her final ragged breaths in London. 1969. The ultimate horror of Delfont lies in how he weaponized the dying embers of Judy's hope, donning the mask of a protective lover to lure her into a sordid relationship of sex and money. To him, Judy Garland was no legend. She was merely a decaying carnal commodity that needed to be wrung dry before being discarded as industrial waste in his revenue reports. Delfont's deception was a dark, gritty masterclass in power harassment and romantic betrayal. He tricked Judy into believing he truly loved her, promising a peaceful sanctuary in London where she could finally escape the specter of debt and abandonment in America. In her chemical haze and crushing guilt, Judy surrendered what remained of her dignity to this lover, unaware she was nothing more than a cheap amusement to satisfy his parasitic instincts. Look directly at this bone-chilling truth while swearing her a future of happiness. Delfont maintained a dignified, high society facade with Lady Delfont, alongside a string of other clandestine affairs. The ultimate depravity reached its peak when he used the very ticket sales earned from Judy's cold sweats and nosebleeds at the Talk of the Town nightclub to pay for his dalliances with young, beautiful mistresses. Delfont turned Judy into a literal, kept slave, tricking her into self-immolating on stage just so he could afford jewelry for the women he hid behind her back. The pinnacle of this media deception was how Delfont staged her London residency as a freak show wrapped in Technicolor silk. He lied to the global press, claiming Judy was having a radiant comeback. But in reality, he was exhibiting her a star decomposing hour by hour to satisfy the cruel curiosity of the mob. Delfont would dispassionately shove Judy onto the stage while she was convulsing from drug-induced shock, her legs bucking and her eyes vacant. When she collapsed under the microphone, pelted with trash and pelted with the audience's insults, he did not stop the clock. He stood in the wings, sipping expensive champagne and calmly counting every British pound earned from her humiliation. This betrayal was the final, fatal blade. Judy realized the man she believed was her harbor was actually a professional human flesh broker who had sold her soul to the media to fuel his own filthy vices. The moment Judy Garland realized the total scope of this romantic fraud was the moment her will to live finally extinguished. She understood that her brilliant success was merely a public auction of a corpse, with Delfont holding the gavel for the final strike. The hemorrhaging hatred from that realization drained her last flickering embers of life. Judy Garland died alone, white-knuckled and penniless. The moment the curtain fell on Delfont's comeback charade, Bernard Delfont stands as the final romantic executioner, a man who coldly profited over a grave that hadn't even grown grass. Having assassinated the dignity of a human being through his limitless greed and calculated infidelity. In her final, heart-wrenching lines scrawled in a cold London room, Judy left behind a stinging indictment of the man who sold her death. Bernard Delfont was the most talented tragedy broker I ever met. He didn't sell concert tickets. He sold tickets to watch me die on stage. He tricked me with a filthy, adulterous love, just so I would scream until I was empty, all to pay for the women he kept behind my back. I realized too late that I had been sold to a sex and money slaughterhouse, where my high notes were just the groans of a commodity being auctioned off. Delfont stripped away my last shred of pride, leaving me to die in shameful poverty, realizing I was nothing but a bloody paycheck for his bottomless greed. Those 8 men stood by and watched her collapse, bartering her life for profit and fame. Judy Garland didn't just succumb to illness. She was exploited to her very last breath. When talent is reduced to a tool for greed, the betrayal of those she trusted most is the deadliest weapon, finishing her long before the sedatives ever could. If you have been moved by this harrowing tragedy and wish to join us in unearthing the buried truths of other legends, please press like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss the Black Files to come.